The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local journalism today at chly.ca/donate. Local news doesn't survive without local support.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. Plans for a development near a wetland ecosystem in the Rock City area have generated concern among local residents and prompted multiple delegations before City Council this month. A permit for a multi-family development with 102 rental units at 3400 Barrington Road was issued on January 5th of this year. At a July 6th council meeting, local resident Tamara Brown raised concerns about environmental impacts of the development, which hasn't gotten started yet, and asked questions about the environmental assessment work done on the issue thus far. We'll get into a few of the details later on in the show. First and foremost, today on the program, we're going to dive into some of the systems at play here. I reached out to West Coast Environmental Law to try and learn more about the rules for development around wetlands in BC.
I'm Russell Chiong. I'm a staff lawyer here at West Coast Environmental Law. I work on the Access to Justice team, particularly with our Summary Advice Clinic, which aims to provide free legal advice, as well as summary information to British Columbians who are concerned about environmental harms and seeking legal pathways for protection, for accountability, or to participate in environmental decision-making.
Where do I need to start to wrap my head around the rules in BC for protecting wetlands during development to kind of get my head around the story of what's going on in Nanaimo?
Yeah, so the space around wetlands is and around our waterways is very, I feel like it's overused, but it is a complex space. There are overlapping provincial and federal pieces of legislation. There's local bylaws that are engaged. And, these developments, they bring together all sorts. They're bringing together landowners, different levels of government, planners, scientists, and community members. And so this sort of complexity, as well as the connection between our developments on land and their effects on aquatic ecosystems, and of course the ripple effects through watersheds, are something that's sort of acknowledged or recognized through our provincial regulatory regime. And so that's the Riparian Areas Protection Regulation, as well as the Riparian Areas Protection Act. And so these used to have different names, but that's what they're called now. Some people will call them RAPPER or RAPPA. But in essence, these set minimum requirements for how developments near waterways should proceed. And they direct certain local governments to meet those requirements, or of course, they have the freedom to exceed them as well. And so this is a recognition of the increased pressures from development on our waterways, especially in the most densely populated areas of the province. So we're looking at communities mostly in the south of the province, including Nanaimo, as well as elsewhere on Vancouver Island, in the lower mainland, and the southern interior as well. And so what the regulations do is they essentially set this procedure of having a buffer zone of about 30 meters from most waterways that connect to waterways with fish, where a qualified environmental professional, also known as just a biologist basically, or a scientist who's been hired by the developer, can do an assessment and identify what areas within that 30-meter zone need to be protected to avoid harm to fish. And so this process of taking the assessment process away from government and into the hands of developer-funded or proponent-funded professionals is a model called professional reliance, which we've seen a lot across the environmental sphere across the province. Yeah, and so once those areas are sort of identified, then that informs how development can proceed. That's sort of the base level procedures that are set out in the regulation. But municipalities and local governments are actually free to use their own existing tools, whether they're development setbacks, development permit areas, conservation zoning. There's a few different tools that local governments already have at their disposal that they can use to sort of meet, I guess, the intent of the regime. And they can actually exceed them as well. And so there's sort of this what's called a meet or exceed or meet or beat provision in the Act, which says that if a local government has in place procedures that and processes that, in their opinion, meet or beat the minimum set in the regulation, then they don't have to follow the regulation exactly.
So we have these rules in BC, RAPR or RAPA, that are intended to define the minimums for protecting areas around waterways. The way we determine whether or not something falls under that is the developer themselves hires a biologist to go do an assessment of the area and decide whether or not it meets the criteria. And on top of that, local governments are able to sort of make their own rules as long as they meet or exceed the minimum set out in RAPA or RAPR. Is that a correct understanding and a good kind of summary of the basics of how this all works?
Yeah, I think so. I'll just note again that the developer hiring the qualified environmental professional, that generally is the case, but there is a little level of flexibility depending on how different municipalities or different local governments sort of set out their bylaws. And the need to meet or exceed is only in the opinion of the local government themselves. And so there are times on the ground where whether they're scientists, environmentalists, communities might look at the requirements and think that they may not be necessarily meeting the requirements. And because of this level of flexibility that there are cases where local governments are really doing very well in certain areas and exceeding the standards in some areas. And then in other areas, they might be falling a little bit short. Compliance has been a little bit of an issue here. I think about 10 years ago, the province released a report that showed that less than half of all municipalities or local governments that were covered by the regulations were in compliance. So less than half are actually setting out procedures for development approvals that met the minimum requirements. And there were calls for more, regulatory teeth or a clear legal tool to enforce compliance, but that really hasn't come to pass. And the province has really been working on more of a cooperative model. And so been working with local governments to ensure that as they update their bylaws, that they are considering the requirements of the regulations. And so they release great guidance materials as well, and they hold sessions too. So I know that we have some amendments to the regulations that are going to come into effect in the new year. And there's been some great language that the province has released to help local governments ensure that their bylaws use the right language to sort of be consistent.
You're listening to Midcoast Morning. I'm speaking with Russell Chiong, a staff lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law. We're talking about the rules for development around wetlands in BC. Our conversation was prompted by concerns raised by residents about a planned development in Nanaimo's Rock City area. There are two wetlands around the property in question, a larger wetland and a smaller seasonal one. At a July 6th council meeting, resident Tamara Brown asked for clarity on how it was determined whether or not the smaller seasonal wetland met the criteria to be subject to the province's riparian areas protection regulation.
Where in the public record was it determined whether the smaller wetland and its seasonal creeks met the provincial definition of a stream under RAPR? If that exists, where can council and the public find it?
To meet the criteria, the wetland would need to be connected to fish-bearing habitat by surface flow. This is the case for the larger wetland, which is subject to RAPR. The 2024 Bioinventory report for the property says that during the wet season, the smaller wetland drains to the larger wetland near the northwest corner of the property. Following Tamara Brown's delegation on July 6th, Jeremy Holm, the City of Nanaimo's Director of Development Approvals, and Kevin Bridges, the city's Environmental Coordinator, fielded questions from Nanaimo City Council. Bridges shared the city's position that the smaller wetland is not connected to the larger one by surface flow.
The Toth report, 2009 report, state it is connected. It does not say whether it is surface flow or not surface flow, but it is hydraulically connected between the small wetland and the large wetland. However, there is no surface flow channel there to and where this matters is whether wrapper applies or not, is because if it is not connected by surface flow, then wrapper does not apply. That's the nuances of the regulation.
I asked Chiong about the significance of whether or not the larger and smaller wetlands on the property in Nanaimo are connected by surface flow.
The concern more is whether a body of water is connected by surface flow to another body of water that houses protected fish. And so those are generally like the native fish that we have around and in the province. And so surface water just means, or surface flow just means flow that goes over the ground. So, you can see sometimes that there are, pools of water that might be connected underground through underground flows. And those generally aren't considered in regulation. And that's, in some ways that is a limitation because, of course, subsurface flows do provide certain ecosystem services. They can support the quality and quantity of water in systems that do support fish. But ultimately, if we're looking at what applies here or how the regulation applies, we're really looking at surface water. And so that surface flow is just, again, water that's flowing over the ground, and it can just be between different kinds of bodies of water. And so in the regulation, they say that it applies to lands with nearby streams. And so you might go into the regulation and think, oh, what is a stream, right? A stream might be a river, might be a creek, it might be just what you would normally imagine as a stream. But as defined in the regulation, it actually does include things like wetlands. It includes bogs and fens and marshes and lakes as well as rivers. And so as long as they're connected by surface water, then the regulation does apply. And so that what that means is that you have this sort of level of consistency across a watershed or throughout a connected system, so that it ensures that we're looking at effects that go downstream. One thing to note is that whether or not the surface water is year-round or the surface flow is year-round actually should not have any bearing on the application of wrapper. And the reason is because in the definition of stream in the regulation, it does state, it does allow for seasonal or ephemeral flows, and actually uses the language of whether or not usually containing water. And so sometimes you'll have, and I think this is more of a concern in the interior where water is a little bit more scarce than, say, out here on the coast, but you may have ecologically important rivers or streams that may not necessarily have full flow all times of the year. Their tributaries may not always have flow all times of the year. And of course, this is becoming more of an issue as we have, see the effects of climate change here in Vancouver. We're having a bit of a heat wave, and we're in pretty high water restrictions earlier in the summer. And this does make one think about how our planning and regulatory processes adapt to a changing climate and a changing landscape.
I'm looking at the bio-inventory report for this proposed development, and it talks about a swamp wetland. It suggests the swamp wetland is not fish-bearing, but it forms part of the headwaters of the Cottle Creek watershed. And it also talks about a small seasonal wetland, and it suggests it's not really clear to me, a layperson reading this water courses section of the report. It's not really clear if this is surface water or not. It says, during the wet season, the wetland drains to the larger wetland near the northwest corner of the property, The wetland boundary and 7.5-meter wetland leaf strip were established as part of the prior subdivision. And watching a recent city council meeting, it seems to be the city's position that they are not, these two wetlands, the smaller one and the larger one, are not connected by surface flow, and therefore wrapper does not apply here. I'm wondering if you can offer me any kind of take on sort of what this means.
I think that it's a little bit hard to interpret these reports. I think whether you do have this background in science or not, but I think that if what is being indicated in the report is that there is surface flow, then of course, even if it's only for part of the year, then of course they should be considered as connected, at least in the eyes of the regulation, and the appropriate setbacks should apply. That being said, it is a little bit hard to tell based on the text there, and I think what this points to is a little bit of the limitation of this professional reliance model that we've seen adopted across across the province, and so it puts a lot of weight, I think, a lot of trust in these qualified environmental professionals to be able to make appropriate assessments based on proper training, sound science, and sufficient resources. But, we also need local governments to be able to have the capacity and expertise to be able to review these and interpret them, and draw the appropriate conclusions as well. And there is a little bit, pretty significant variation in terms of different local governments' capacity to do that. And of course, we're not relying on a single report. There are also time limitations as well, and in that seasonal conditions vary, as do conditions from year to year. And so sometimes observations in one report may not necessarily be reflected back in another one. And it's important that we do have ongoing monitoring and assessment of our natural environment to ensure that ecosystem values are being protected and they are being taken into account, and that we're accounting for this natural variation that does occur.
Well, what would be the significance of whether or not wrapper applies to this wetland? I know I mentioned the city's position seems to be that they are not connected. Can you help me understand, whether or not a wrapper applies to this small wetland? What would that change?
So that should theoretically change what the threshold is for the assessment area for the wetland. According to the minimum standards under wrapper, it's a 30-meter assessment area, and that within that assessment area, the qualified environmental professional will identify generally a smaller area that has to be protected in order to avoid harm to fish and fish habitat, or habitat that supports fish habitat that's further downstream. And so if they are connected by surface flow, then that would imply that that wrapper should apply, and as a result, this different assessment area setback should be in place. But of course, I think one of the controversies here in Nanaimo has been the sufficiency of these setbacks, and I think what's coming up is sort of this challenge of whether the setbacks that are used by the city of Nanaimo are analogous to this assessment area, or whether they're analogous to what's called a streamside protection and enhancement area, which is the area that has to be protected. And so in general, the streamside protection enhancement area cannot have development on it, whereas the riparian assessment area can, as long as it's outside of the streamside protection and enhancement area. And I think that there are interpretations of the framework that there is in Nanaimo, that the riparian leaf strips that are in place, so the setbacks away from these water courses, whether it's 7.5 meters in some cases, 15 meters in other cases, and 30 meters in other cases. I think there's some, there are some interpretations of that would be more analogous to the riparian areas assessment area rather than the streamside protection and enhancement area, meaning that theoretically the assessment area should be closer to 30 meters for all these water courses rather than having this gradation.
Who is kind of the arbiter of these situations, or like what is the level of oversight in general with Rapper in cities when it comes to these developments? How does that work?
So I think it depends from city to city, but what I can say is that it really is on cities to sort of police themselves in terms of compliance with the minimum requirements of Rapper. And so, as I mentioned before, there aren't really many, or there isn't really a legal tool for the government, provincial government, to enforce compliance with the regulatory regime. And in fact, the meet or beat requirements allow cities and local governments to use their own opinion or judgment of whether they are meeting or exceeding the requirements. And so that really isn't, there isn't really a clear mechanism from the top down to ensure accountability, but from, at a local level, it is important that that citizens and residents are keeping an eye on things and making sure that whether they're developers or the cities themselves or other local governments are held accountable and are keeping to their mandates of protecting the public interest, in particular in these environmental or environmentally sensitive areas, protecting ecosystem values.
Midcoast Morning is part of our nonprofit newsroom project, supported by listeners like you. Keep this program on the air by funding it today with a monthly sustaining donation at chly.ca/donate. We've got tote bags and shirts if you need an incentive.
Today on the program, we're talking about the systems in place that dictate how development can be done around wetlands in BC. A planned development in the Rock City area has been the subject of multiple citizen delegations before Nanaimo City Council in the last month. Concerns have been raised about whether environmental assessment has been commensurate with the potential impact to the area, with particular concern about whether or not a small wetland near the property would qualify for a higher standard of environmental assessment than has been carried out. At a July 20th City Council meeting, Nanaimo CAO Dale Lindsay joined briefly via Zoom to reiterate the city's position that the smaller wetland was found not to fall under provincial legislation.
And on the smaller of the wetlands, which has had a lot of the focus in recent weeks, it was found not to be applicable to provincial legislation. The good news is that the city has a higher level of protection than the provincial and federal regulations and policies in place. So our regulations, our watercourse regulations, take into account more than fish habitat. We have a long-standing practice of considering all impacts on the environment. So because of that, there's actually a setback in protection from the smaller wetland. It is not Rapper. The larger wetland was and continues to be identified as Rapper, RAR before that. So not only does it have the city setback, but it also has the recommendations that come from the Queen.
I'm speaking with Russell Chiong, a staff lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law, to try and better understand the rules for development around wetlands in BC.
If the wetland isn't connected to the other wetland, then RAPA wouldn't apply. And as a result, the city would be free to set whatever kind of setback that it would want or have any kind of assessment process around it that they would want. And if it is, then, if the city is of the opinion that it is meeting or beating the requirements under the regulations, then it is in the clear in a way and based on the operation of our current regulatory regime. And so whether or not, scientists or community members may think that it sufficiently protects the environment is another question, but meeting the minimum requirements from the province, or at least in their opinion, meeting the minimum requirements is certainly sufficient.
How do you think we can zoom out from all of these systems and zoom back into someone who's trying to understand a specific case of a specific proposed development in their community and how they can kind of grapple with that or even understand what's going on?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a challenge because again, this is a really complex space, and you have all these different systems that are sort of working together, overlapping, sometimes conflicting with each other. And of course, taking all of that down into the individual level is so dependent on the specific circumstances of, which local government covers you, and the specific like hydrology and geography of your watershed. I'm not going to call for everyone to be an expert or become an expert on their local bylaws or on the regulation, but I think that it is helpful to have to read into some of the materials that are out there, whether they're from your local government or there are a few different public resources online as well that sort of lay out what the wrapper process is, or what that framework looks like. And I think those can be quite helpful in terms of giving people a baseline understanding. And then when it comes to actually being involved, or addressing potential environmental harms in their own communities, I think in this case, the advocates in Nanaimo have been doing a great job in participating in public hearings or in council meetings and getting involved in this local decision-making process on the project level. That's a great place to direct energy, and especially if you can, if community members are able to provide solutions or provide paths forward that can sort of enable their local governments to make, in their eyes, the right decision. That's always a great path. But looking forward, there's also this more systemic issue around how developments are approved and how riparian areas are being assessed. And so again, the province only sets minimum requirements. A lot of municipalities are just meeting them. Some are below, some are above, and some are above in some ways and below in other ways. And so just making sure that you're familiarizing yourself with what exactly your local government is doing, and maybe finding ways that you think would be valuable for things to be improved, or ways that you think there could be improvements to better protect ecosystem values or better inform sound environmental decision making. I think that as we're going into the new year, there will be some amendments again that are coming into force on wrapper, and this might be an opportunity if, as some local governments will be amending their bylaws, it may be an opportunity to advocate for strengthening and finding more ways to sort of beat or exceed the provincial minimum requirements.
Russell Chiong is a staff lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, you can email us at news@chly.ca. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. That's all for now. We'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
This program gives thanks to the Snuneymuxw First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.